My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center, and I'm very glad y'all could join us for the first of a series of webinars on citizen science and minority inclusion in research. I want to say two sort of promo things. I'll introduce our speaker. The first is that the next speaker in this series will be Alex Perlman, talking in a couple weeks on a framework for collectively defined ethics standards for independent researchers and community bio groups. The information for that is on all the social media sites as well as the center's website, which is ethics.uncc.edu. The second thing is we're doing a series on disability issues and narratives around disability. The first speaker for that will be Rosemary Garland Thompson on November 5th. So that's at the save the date level, but we'll have a material out for that soon. Today's speaker is Dr. Angelique Hjarding, who is a postdoc here at UNC Charlotte. She's done all sorts of interesting biodiversity and conservation work. She started on the South Carolina Barrier Islands with loggerhead turtles. She's been to Laos to work with clouded leopard populations, as well as producing maps and plans for important bird conservation areas, African chameleons, and other threatened species. One of the questions that I think she says is sort of narrative throughout the research has been, how do you have conservation and involve the local community? That work has taken her to the Bahamas, as well as some resilience planning and other islands around there. So she's currently a postdoc here in the Geography and Earth Sciences Department and for the Charlotte Action Research Project. And I will let her introduce her talk. So Angel, all yours.
All right. Thank you, Gordon, for inviting me to be here. And it's really fun to get to actually be the speaker, where I have been attending thanks to being invited to several of the bioethics talks over the past, I guess, year and a half or so, thanks to Lisa Rasmussen. And they've been such interesting topics in person pre-COVID, but I've really enjoyed many of the speakers that have been brought to campus through this ethics series. So thank you. And so I feel honored to get to now be one of the speakers, and hopefully I can live up to the work that others have shared. Hopefully this will work in the way that I'm wanting it to work. Let's see, desktop 2. Okay. And all right. So the title of my presentation today is From Monarchs to Mangroves, and hopefully throughout the presentation you will understand why and how these two different species are connected and what they have to do with public science and conservation. So I'm hoping I'm going to be able to lay that out succinctly for you, and in a broader context also talk about what this has to do with more broadly using equity to engage communities. All right. So I first want to start off by talking about the discipline of science as a whole. Science, as we think about it, is inherently a top-down discipline. At least that's how I was trained as a biologist. So my background is as a conservation biologist. I have an undergraduate degree in biology, a master's in biology, and then I did my PhD here at UNC Charlotte as a geographer. And at least in my bachelor's and my master's degrees, I was trained to do this field of science of studying communities, or in this case, studying communities of whether it was sea turtles, communities of large cats in Asia, or studying communities of people like ants. This is all how we've been trained throughout the sciences of how we study. And scientists train and do this to become experts. The specialists, we're often one of only few people who deeply and intimately know our topic of study. We deeply study these species, ecosystems, and communities, and it's all in our effort to better be able to understand these systems and processes in which they interact. So this is what we expect. We go and we meet with other peers, and we're each going to have our own area of specialty that we each work in and specialize in. But while this depth of knowledge is important to unlocking the wonders of the universe, it isn't the only knowledge we need to truly understand what's going on. So my area of expertise, that depth of knowledge I have, is in the field of conservation planning. It is defined as a systematic approach to locating and designing ideal spaces to conserve species and ecosystems. As conservation planners, we are trained to evaluate biodiversity data and ecosystems and make a plan for how best to conserve a species or habitat. There are lots of great tools out there to help us make and develop these plans as conservation planners and to help us achieve optimal conservation plans. Some examples out there are NatureServe Vista, which is what conservation planners in North Carolina use to help with planning locally. There is MarkSAN, which I have used quite extensively on a global level, CRAN, which is a R package prioritizer, many others, but it's a very quantitative modeling procedure. It's all from very top down. We take data of biodiversity and we model it and we look at it and we create priorities for what we think we should plan. The USDA, a governmental agency through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they are our conservation planners for the federal government, and they even have a step-by-step conservation planning process where you identify, look at the objectives, you inventory your resources, analyze the data, formulate alternatives, evaluate making decisions, you implement your plan, and you've got all these great things to conserve these resources. And you've got USDA has NRCS representatives in all of our, each county should have an NRCS rep that can go out and come and help you create a conservation plan for your farm or your large piece of land. So even they recognize the importance of conservation planning, and these dedicated teams support these landowners or support individual landowners in setting aside land for conservation. On the global context, we have something called the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. It's a global database of threat assessments for species. There are also regional IUCN Red List assessments available for many of these species. Most of these assessments are conducted by academic researchers and scientists. For my own master's research, I did a whole lot of mapping work to support species like the Keniangia, oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've even had to say this name. The Latin on this one is bugging me out. I'm not even going to butcher it, but basically the Usambara chameleon. But the point is I did a lot of work on this as a master's student, as a graduate student. I created maps for this and probably 80 other East African chameleons. And if you'll notice under the citation, my name isn't there. And there's also many, many other people that have probably contributed, actually I know for a fact, have contributed to these assessments, and their names are also not there. Doesn't mean I didn't put in the work, and it doesn't mean that other people didn't put into work creating these assessments. But I'm going to just put a marker in there that these named spots on these global species assessments are reserved for those with PhDs or those who had named credibility in the field. Pulled out this map of the Bahamas for BirdLife International. This is another conservation planning tool on a global level. And what I'm trying to do is sort of set the stage for what conservation planning is so we can go into the other sides of it if you haven't caught on there. So we have BirdLife International has set out all of these super designated spots of if we want to conserve birds in the Bahamas, these are the most critical spaces that we should look at conserving. outside of any of the other spaces. We can quickly identify them by pulling up the map and triage and say, okay, well, if we've only got money to spend on conservation, we've only got $1 million to spend on conservation in the Bahamas, then maybe we should just spend it on one of these green marked areas instead of trying to spend it on one of the other spaces because it's going to make the most impact. And that's how conservation money is determined, conservation investments are determined by using maps and assessments that are done like these. These are based off of IUCN Red List. So those maps, those assessments that were done, and other processes that are all done in our academic institutions. Another set of similar types of designations are key biodiversity areas, and these are all recognized by the United Nations Environment Program, and this is where a lot of our global United Nations money goes towards conservation. These key biodiversity areas, where I find them interesting, is they were created to conserve the most critical populations of the world's threatened species. So if we're looking at this from an, oh my gosh, we have killed off almost everything of this one particular species, and if we have to find the one space where we can conserve them the most, and we're going to make sure that the little space is the most important space for them. But the goal is to conserve, with these KBAs, to conserve the largest and most important populations of these species. And then I couldn't leave out my own conservation planning example. This is my very first conservation planning map that I ever made when I work at University of Copenhagen, where I did important chameleon areas. So I took that BirdLife International Important Bird Areas, and I took some other data with all the species distribution maps that I made, and I did these as desktop assessments. I have to this day never stepped foot on the African continent. Yet as an academic graduate student researcher, I was able to make conservation planning assessments for species in Africa. So just think about that for a minute, what I was able to do. And these are things that that governments and countries will take and look at and make conservation planning, make planning investment decisions based on my work sitting in Denmark, looking at their country from a map and looking at it from a data perspective. So all this happened for me. This map was made in 2011. And I was pretty impressed with myself at what I was able to accomplish with the data and modeling at that time, and how I could sit there and present these ideas and recommendations for conserving these species. But I kept having this nagging problem. And I felt this with all the conservation work that was going on around me. What about all the people? So when we look at, this is actually the recently updated map of the population density of the world for 2020. When we look at the map of where are the people, what about the people, you start to look and see that there are correlations between the density of people and where we have species richness around the world. So for those of you that are not biologists or haven't spent time talking about species richness, when we talk about that, that's the number of different species we found in an area. So the more different species you have, the higher the species richness there is in an area. So if you have a lower number of species, it's the lower species richness. Another term we also use is endemics. So endemic species are species that you only find in certain areas in the world. So for example, one of our endemic species in North Carolina is the Venus flytrap. You only find it in these coastal swamps in eastern North Carolina. So it's endemic, it's found nowhere else in the world, which is why they are protected so heavily under the US Endangered Species Act. But what you see is there are correlations between endemic species. So the closer you are to the equator, the more endemic species you have, and also the higher species richness you have. You also find the closer to the equator or in your tropical regions, you also have a higher density of people. So when you look at The map on the left, of course, is the people. The map on the right is of species richness. And so whether it's for birds, mammals, amphibians, by and large, the patterns are very similar. But what that also means when these correlate, that these high species richness and these endemic species are also the ones that are going to be the most vulnerable to human development and anthropogenic changes caused by human impacts on the earth. So one of the ways that the global United Nations World and Environmental World decided to start to look at this is in 2011, the same time I was learning to be the master of conservation maps, the United Nations agreed, and the world agreed to support something called the Aichi biodiversity targets. And the idea behind these was that if we globally met these targets, we would start to reverse biodiversity loss on the planet. And while we made some progress towards these targets, we didn't actually meet any of them. And this just came out in the Global Biodiversity Outlook #5. So this was news a couple of weeks ago, actually. There was quite a few news articles like, oh my gosh, the world, 2020, we didn't meet the targets. And what are we going to do? There was some progress towards some of them around invasive species, protected areas, but by and large, we didn't meet any of them. So this image on the side of this slide is they have strategic goals that they broke these up into. In each one of these, there are 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. The idea is if we met all of these, we would create a world where we lived in harmony with nature. That's very idealistic. I would love to see that happen, and it's a great goal to reach for. But we've got a lot of work to do to get there. What I will point out is this is one of the first times in conservation planning at a global scale that you start to see this idea of people being brought into conservation. It was still done at a top-down level, looking at strategic goal A, increasing awareness of biodiversity, biodiversity values integrated into planning, incentives for biodiversity conservation, but it's still how can we get the people to do what we want them to do? But it's not actually asking people what do they need out of conservation. So through all of this work, what I have challenged the conservation world to do is to say no more conservation planning like this. And I hope I have, in this sort of brief introduction to conservation planning, made the case to you for how conservation has been generally conducted at this top-down, studying ants through a microscope or a lens, that this isn't how we should do it. It's not a bad approach, but it hasn't really worked either. Seeing all these great Aichi biodiversity targets, laying out this roadmap for what we should be doing to create a planet that lives in harmony with nature, but we still are missing these major targets that shouldn't, in theory, be hard to meet, but why aren't we meeting them? And what are the barriers? What are some of these major barriers to this? I won't say that this approach to conservation, this top-down approach, is why we haven't achieved the Aichi targets, but I'm not going to say it isn't a major contributor either. As researchers and applied conservation planners, myself and my colleagues have been trained to do our work in this top-down way. But to make that change, we need to now work on ensuring that the people that are part of those ecosystems that we're trying to protect are instead part of the solution. And stop treating conservation research like we're studying an anthill. Instead, asking the people that are part of those ecosystems what it is that they need and how they want to study those ecosystems instead. So that brings me to the butterfly highway. How did I make this switch from being a top-down conservation planner to one that included people in the process? Well, it wasn't easy. I came to UNC Charlotte in fall of 2012 to study for my PhD in Geography and Earth Sciences department. I had planned to work on a project modeling plant disease, sudden oak death, but the professor who recruited me left to go to another university. At the time, I was still in the mindset of a top-down conservation planner, but I decided to take a course offered in our department on planning theory, as in like planning theory. I figured it couldn't hurt and it might be fun to take a walk on the human geography side of things, because I was very much a physical geographer. And that was one thing I quickly learned when I stepped into the world of geography, is that we were segregated, and that there were human geographers on one side and there were physical geographers on the other side, and that we typically did not mix. The class opened up a whole new world of science and research that I never even considered, having been a quantitative modeler. The professor who taught the class was Dr. Jenny Sorensen, and she was not just any regular old planner. Her area of research was participatory action research. Some people on our research team scoffed at my excitement about taking the class, but what they didn't realize is that I finally found a way to address a question that had been tugging at me my whole career in conservation. I finally found a how to bring people into the conservation planning story. And not just giving a superficial voice to communities, but actually giving them a place in the research process. This is what participatory action research as a methodology laid out for me, was the how could I do this? It was powerful stuff that could change the way of how we do conservation. When my advisor left to go to that other university, Jenny adopted me, even though we were both strangers to each other's disciplines. That created a whole other world that we had to navigate, of how does a planner who studied participatory action research and feminist theory have conversations with someone who is a quantitative research modeler. I'll never forget the first time she said, let's reflect on this idea. And I was like, I don't understand what you mean. And I think coming and speaking in an ethics and philosophy space, like, you reflect on things all the time, but this was not how we phrase the work that we do in biology. Like, this is just even that, thinking about stopping and reflecting on our practices, putting those words together and into our discipline. That is like foreign conversation topics. And these are the things that we have to start dismantling these and taking these things as not being foreign and start crossing these disciplinary bridges to start to be able to address some of these things. So, but that was really like, that's how far I was. Like, I couldn't even reflect on things in the right way until I met Jenny. So I spent the summer of 2013 supporting her research group, SHARP, the Charlotte Action Research Project, which is based in what used to be Metropolitan Studies, but now I'm finally getting used to calling URSI, or Urban Research and Community Engagement. But I spent the summer supporting SHARP in conducting a women's safety audit in the Enderley Park neighborhood. This is as social science research as you can get. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was so much fun because it was a completely different type of field work for me. I spent hours at community meetings, listening to neighborhood residents talk about the challenges they faced in their neighborhood. I also visited other neighborhood meetings as part of SHARP to listen and observe. That fall, I was in my second year of my PhD, and the pressure was on, since I was going to have to completely start whatever my dissertation was going to be from scratch. At the core, I knew I wanted to do something related to urban conservation, but how did I mesh that with the work of SHARP? Enter the butterfly highway. At every community meeting, I heard the same need for neighborhood beautification, but the residents met numerous barriers to accomplishing the projects they dreamed about for their community. Stories about the declining monarch butterfly populations were all over the news, and it came to me one day. Maybe we could come up with a project that addressed beautification for the neighborhoods and urban pollinator habitat at the same time. I talked to neighborhood leaders, asked them about the name. At first, I had actually proposed a bee highway. I got big, fat, no bee highway to my neighborhood. Butterfly Highway was much more amenable. I got a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and together we planted over 50 pollinator habitats in 6 neighborhoods in Charlotte over that next summer. What I didn't realize was a project that started out to bring flowers to a community would become a project that was focused on much more than just those flowers. Through my research, I learned that the social outcomes of the project far outweighed the biological outcomes. Not that the biological outcomes weren't important, but truly from the community perspective, listening to the communities, this is what was valuable to them, was those social outcomes. Because of my work with Yenny, because of my work with Sharp, I was able to hear that from the community and be able to bring these two things together, that we could address a social and environmental problem at the same time. And that is so critical to the work that I do now, is being able to not separate the two, but understand and look at how they are intricately entwined. The garden helped to build social capital in neighborhoods and increase participants' connection to place. They created a new social outlet for neighbors to get together and discuss flowers and butterflies instead of the things that were plaguing their neighborhoods or the problems and challenges they faced, as well as creating new opportunities for intergenerational connections among neighbors. One story that I had from a participant talked about how they had always wanted to try to find a way to connect with their elderly neighbor, woman that was a neighbor across the street, but they didn't know how, until they had the idea of asking her if she wanted to be part of the Butterfly Highway with them. And then they and their young daughter, who was 5 at the time, they started being able to go over there and helping her with the garden. And it became a project with neighbors across the street from one another, with a young family that had moved into the neighborhood and someone who lived in the neighborhood for 50 years. The Butterfly Highway is still alive, though serving a different capacity today than it was originally created for. The work that community leaders and I started through the original Butterfly Highway at UNC Charlotte still lives on. So if you see the Butterfly Highway out and about, it might not be the same Butterfly Highway, but it does take its origins in the work that I have shared with you today. Several of the original participants in the Butterfly Highway have continued to stay involved in citizen science, being part of projects such as the Air Keepers program through Clean Air Carolina, where they are monitoring air quality in their community using low-cost air quality sensors. Others have started a community-based nonprofit, the North End Community Coalition, and others have been using the skills that they have gained as part of the Butterfly Highway to hone their skills in grant writing and other nonprofit leadership skills. And then my dear friend Sala has started a project on nature equity in Charlotte. And how all of this became a reality for them is not only were they just participants in the project through using participatory action research methods, they were part of the research from beginning and all the way through various different stages of the project. And even once I had finished my dissertation and graduated, so I finished in 2017, this picture was taken in 2019. We were still working together, doing projects in the community far beyond my work. So while we started as research partners, we became friends and colleagues, and doing this work continued on. And we're still friends and colleagues today. So that's the butterfly piece. So where does the next chapter fit in? I want to introduce you to the Cat Island Conservation Institute, and this is the next chapter of my research. It is connected very much to the Butterfly Highway. It takes its foundations in the Butterfly Highway. It takes learned lessons from the Butterfly Highway, but this is my mangroves. And I'm also going to give credit, I did not design all these slides. I borrowed these slides from my partner, my research partner in the Bahamas, Nikita Shilroll, because she is an ace graphic designer, and her slides are much better than what I could have put together on my own. But because we have been doing this research together, we have been telling this story in multiple spaces together. So like I said, I wanted to give credit to this part of the slides of being hers. So what is the Cat Island Conservation Institute? It's something that grew out of post-Hurricane Dorian. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, Hurricane Dorian came and parked its big hurricane self over Abaco and Grand Bahama Islands and created massive destruction in the northern Bahamas. My colleague, Nikita Shiel-Roll, sat in her home in Cat Island, which is to the south, and which did not face any of the destruction from Dorian, but wondered, what can I do? All of my fellow Bahamians are facing loss of life and destruction. Their homes are being wrecked, and I just don't know what I can do. Well, during her work at University of Miami, she had started a community-based conservation program in the Bahamas called Young Marine Explorers. Her work very much parallels the work I did with the Butterfly Highway, except she did it with marine conservation in the Bahamas, whereas I was doing urban pollinator conservation work in Charlotte. What grew out was this idea of creating a Cat Island Conservation Institute to focus on serving the community and creating a participatory science institute. And this has really been a, I guess we'll call it the love child of YME and Butterfly Highway coming together to really look at how do we create sustainable islands, because there are so many parallels between what we see in our urban spaces and what happens on our islands when we look at creating resilient spaces for people. So just like I talked about with the Butterfly Highway, we are also using participatory action research methods to do our work with the Cat Island Conservation Institute. One of the first places we did that was developing a community climate action plan. That was done immediately after Hurricane Dorian. The Minister of the Environment actually adopted and declared the climate crisis declaration that was community developed. It was never actually adopted by the country, but it was still a move in the right place. We're still working on this idea of communities defining what does an action plan look like for them to address climate change. It's not something that I can do as a top-down researcher, but what I can do is bring my knowledge from the theory and the global work that I've done and help that inform the directions that community members need to do the work in their own communities. I can also bring my expertise in conservation planning to help train community scientists so that they have the skills to do community-based natural resource management. My colleague Nikita is a marine scientist. She can bring her skills into training community scientists to participate and run a community genetics lab. And these are all community members. I've met or know most of them that are in these images. While she took the pictures, I know most of them. Many of them have a high school education at best, but yet we are talking about training them to do biodiversity genetics. Just think about that. We focus on inclusive conservation practices. Everything is co-designed based on community needs, bridging local knowledge and conservation science. We will not do any sort of marine planning without having fishers involved, because they are the ones that know the coral reefs, they know the fishing needs, they know their livelihoods depend on good fishing management practices, which also means making sure that we have fish for them to fish for the rest of their lives or to feed their families. It's creating equitable partnerships in the community. It once again protects these livelihoods and the biodiversity at the same time. It is not separating the social and the environmental. It's looking at how do we support both of these together. Specifically looking also with Nikita's expertise, how do we build capacity for doing coral restoration in the community? So that community members are the ones that have the tools to be able to go out and restore the coral reefs and do that management and do the surveys, not relying on foreign researchers to come in and do, which is what currently is happening in the Bahamas. It's foreign researchers that come in and study the reefs, do reef management. Instead, we're currently raising money to train community members to become science divers and to get their dive certifications and learn how to do dive surveys and be able to be the ones restoring the coral reefs around the islands where they live. The ocean is their classroom. They don't have to leave the islands. They don't have to come to the US to get this education that they need. We are bringing it to the community instead of, you know, flipping that switch right now. If you are in the Bahamas and you want to get conservation education, you have to leave the country. And instead, we're saying, you know what, you don't have to do that. You don't have to wait 6 years or 8 years or whatever it might take to get a graduate degree to be able to come back and protect the environment and do conservation work in your own country. We're going to bring the experts to you, and we're going to work together as a team and develop what does this look like for your community to do this work. Altogether, this fosters a new sense of community. It builds that social capital in a space that there's often despair. Many of these community members that are participating in this work, they don't have piped running water into their homes. They have to go to a well. We're talking 2020 in in a quite wealthy nation, but it's not actually the Bahamians that own the wealth. It's the 1%ers that go to the Bahamas for the tax shelter. And they drive up that GDP for the Bahamas, but yet most of the Bahamians live well below the poverty line. It also provides opportunities to celebrate culture and heritage. Nikita's done an amazing job of reaching into the community and doing things like paint nights and integrating conservation with art and other ways, so that we are not, again, separating the social from the science. We are bringing social and science together, culture and science together. It's all one space together. We're learning from the elders of the community. We're fostering creativity. There's a mural project that we're working on, trying to get launched, to paint what each of the Sustainable Development Goals mean as murals across the island. Inclusive learning, experiential, creative, and digital learning, creating access for students to better have access outside the world. Right now, there's limited access to education opportunities on the islands, especially on the smaller family islands, where often they'll have one teacher to teach K through 12 in some communities. Let's see. So I mentioned briefly the Certified Community Scientist program. That's something that we're really putting a lot of focus on. This is taking, when we talk about public science, this is taking public science to a whole new level. When we talk about equity in science, this is taking it to a whole new level. This is training community members to take their expertise in their local community and learn the processes of science so that they can become paid research team members, with the goal of, so not doing volunteer science participation as is typical in citizen science, but actually being able to join foreign research teams as local community experts with research expertise and how we do these processes of science. And our ultimate goal is that when these foreign researchers come and ask for research permits from the Bahamian government, that there will be a pool of community scientists that they have to hire a certain number of community scientists from the local islands to be able to get that research permit. The community lab is sort of what we call our overall learning environment. And that this is how we're trying to envision what this equitable community space of environmental conservation looks like. It could be a physical space. So maybe that we'll have a physical community lab in the Bahamas that might also serve as a hurricane shelter, because there aren't enough hurricane shelters, but where we can create a safe space that could also double up as a space in a time of need. It could also be a space for helping to build literacy or other skills that community members need to be able to do and be active participants in this work. It really is dependent on what that community defines that they need And then we, as the research partners, reach into our community and help to bring those resources to the community. And it's really about supporting lifelong learning. It is not just about the youth in the community. While they're very important, there's also a lot of value in the adults in the community as well to be able to participate and do this work and model. There's a high level of unemployment. I think currently the Bahamas is at 45% unemployment. While this isn't going to solve the unemployment issue, it does create another avenue for potential employment opportunities on the islands that is outside of tourism. The community choral nursery is just one of those spaces. In art and culture, I mentioned the paint nights, doing things like murals, but once again, it is about bringing together these different spaces and offering a transdisciplinary approach to scientific engagement. That the arts facilitates this creative thinking, that it is thinking outside the box. It is not just thinking inside this quantitative research box. I got an opportunity to jump into it because of my PhD work. I think that the more we can push ourselves as scientists to move into, and as researchers, to move into different disciplines, even if it means that we are putting ourselves in spaces we're a little bit uncomfortable with, the better off we are. So I just want to wrap this up with sort of summarizing this back to this whole topic of the conversation and how this all fits with this talk. Is public science, which includes community science and citizen science. They're all important tools to ensure equitable engagement of communities in science if we use them in the right ways and we use them in intentional ways. It is more than just data collection. Very often, especially for natural scientists, researchers, citizen science is just thought of as a data collection tool, but we can really think about this as a tool to start to bring equity into our scientific research and as a way to start to break down these barriers of who does research and who is the one who is participating in the scientific processes, who is at the table driving the research questions, not just collecting that data, but who determines what it is that we research and how we research it. And as institutional researchers, it is our responsibility to ensure that our research is designed to be inclusive of these types of opportunities, to be able to support equitable and community engagement, and to actively work to increase opportunities for our community partners to access scientific knowledge and the resources they need to participate in the processes of science. There's this long history of institutional exploitation and abusive communities that we have to overcome to gain the trust of communities that we have worked with and we would like to work with, and to be able to engage in intentional and authentic community engagement and research. And I would like to argue that we can utilize public science as a tool to help us do that. And that's what I have to say for today.
Hey, thanks, Angel. So we have a bit of time left for conversation, and since we're a fairly small group, I wonder if we're going to try to self-moderate. Lisa, you had typed the question in the chat, but I'm hoping there are others who would like to jump in.
Okay. Are certain biodiversity areas underrepresented because people aren't mapping in some areas? I would say that's a yes. And there is definitely a phenomenon in biodiversity research around people like to do research where they know they're going to find like species. So think about it, it works with citizen science too, is, you know, you don't want to go out and do surveys in places you're not going to find. You're not going to find fun stuff. You're not going to record things. And that also means you're not going to map spaces that, and get good counts and observations of places that, you know, you don't know where you're going to find stuff. So I definitely would say that is underrepresented.
Yeah, I was just to jump in, I was thinking, as you showed that map, you know, theoretically there could be places with far more diversity that just
I don't know
haven't
if that
been.
is me.
Can you hear me?
There was a strange echo for a second, but we
Maybe
heard
it's
you
because
too.
my twin's still on. No. Can you hear me, Angel? Maybe I'll put it in the chat.
I could hear it clearly, for what it's worth.
Okay, that helps.
I can hear you.
Angel still having a hard time? I'll put my question for you. Well, I'll say it
I
first and
still
then
can't
I'll.
hear you.
Okay.
Oh, oh no.
Is Angel muted, perhaps?
I think maybe her speaker isn't hooked up or something, but you heard me initially. She heard me initially. So I'll just state my question.
Oh, okay. So it's me. All right, maybe let's see what happened.
Can you hear me now?
Yay. Okay, so it was me because I was running dual monitors, and it must have been when I switched monitors that it did something with my speakers because it was showing it worked. Okay, thanks.
Cool. Okay. So I was saying, as I looked at the map, I was thinking there could be places theoretically with far more biodiversity than any of the currently known ones, but we just wouldn't be able to protect them because they were not mapped for multiple reasons potentially, right? That people weren't being paid to do that. They didn't have the tools to do that, you know? And so there's a self-ratifying cycle here because you aren't mapping the places where you need it the most potentially.
Yeah, so I'm actually, because she is here, Nikita, can I get you to comment on that? Because as a community member who is dealing with this exact issue, I'm sure you were not expecting me to call on you. Nikita is my research partner in the Bahamas, and I was hoping she was going to be able to jump on today. So I'm like, this is part of why Nikita and I do this work together, is to address some of these biodiversity knowledge gaps. So Nikita, if you can answer that for Lisa, that'd be awesome.
Hi, everyone. I was not expecting to be on camera, but it's beautiful to be here. And I thought it was an incredible conversation. And absolutely, there are major data gaps that exist. And I mean, there's so many data scarce regions of the world. And what happens is that these communities are part of one of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities. And so really being able to, fascinating project that Angel and I are working on right now is how do we improve the data network for our Department of Meteorology? Because a perfect example, all the predictions and forecasting for all the weather in the Bahamas, 700 islands and over thousands of keys are based on 2 islands, recordings from 2 islands. And just speaking to the government this morning, they were talking about, these projects are just given to them, like passed on for them to apply, but the skills don't exist for people to be able to apply them. And then also the connection is not being made as to what this data that's being collected is used for. And so you don't have, my community, maybe people, highest education for sure is maybe high school, but many people don't have high school. And so when you're talking about how do we participate in citizen science, how do we fill those major data gaps that exist, it means that we have to really meaningfully engage communities. And so Angel, I thought you did a fantastic job. And I really do believe that this approach is one that can tap into the community needs, engage communities, inspire lifelong learning, and then fill these major gaps that exist, whether you're talking about meteorology data or you're talking about conservation biology data or anything else, because it's the method of how we ensure that the community members' needs are met, and also that enables us to learn about the world that we live in so we can make better decisions as policymakers and decision makers.
Thanks.
So it's a different question, but I know, so a lot of species have really big ranges. And so, and I know if you think about, like, you know, if you're gonna conserve like the prairie or something, right, there's certain areas that you have to be big enough to successfully conserve some of the species. So how do you guys work through that kind of problem? It's like, I can see that, like, you can create, you know, small environments for local species or ones that sort of move around like pollinators, but larger species are really hard to know because they go across jurisdictions and property lines and all this other stuff. So I'm just wondering how can you model this community approach when the kinds of biodiversity you're looking to conserve don't necessarily fit within a community very easily?
So I think that's a really good question. And I think my best response to that would be they're each going to have a local space that they will interact and live in. And while we might not be able to do comprehensive for the entire range, so I'll think about green sea turtles, for example. They have a very large range. They'll range up to the Carolina coast, all the way down to the Bahamas, down to the Yucatan Peninsula, for whether it's for their adults to their young stages where they lay eggs. And I think you'll have some groups that will do monitoring of, you know, egg hatches, and some groups that will do other types of monitoring when you see them on the reefs. But it'll be more of a collective effort towards it. But I think it'll have to just be on that very local level, and then it'll just have to be a patch additive monitoring piece versus being a more comprehensive. And I think the other side to that is it's then my responsibility as a researcher in conservation to share and connect with other conservation researchers who are doing similar work about doing this kind of work on the ground in the community. And we help connect our communities at the top and then have those deep community connections individually.
Lisa, I know you had a bit of a follow-up, is that right? Or at least a different question.
Yeah, well, it's a slightly different question, but you know, Angel knows I'm involved in ethics and citizen science as well, and we've talked about this kind of issue. But now that we've had the whole presentation laid out, I sort of want to, I'll think about how to ask this. As we who are trained in traditional research approach communities, and we want to do it with, and we need to do it with humility, and having done some work ahead of time so that we're not inviting communities to tell us over and over again what is needed. I was wondering if you have some, I don't know, additional tips about the right way to think about approaching communities to establish a good, trusting relationship and to be sort of subservient to the community needs as opposed to the research needs, even though the research needs still are needs, right? It still needs to get done. So sort of thinking about takeaways from you about this.
Yeah, that's great, because I think there are a few other things that I would like to share on, like, how do you do this? Like, that's great, I did it, and it sounds great, and I love your approach, but how do I actually do this myself? Like, where do I even begin? But that's a question I get a lot. Like, I love what you do, but how do I do this myself? I guess the first thing I would say is that we need institutional change in how our institutions look at how we do research. We need these artificial time limits on our research when we're doing participatory research to get removed. Thinking that we can do participatory community research in 2 to 3 years is junk. It takes 5 to 7 years to truly do good, solid, intentional community research. This is from funders' perspectives. They need to take that off. This is from institutional perspectives, and that does not fit very well if you are an assistant professor looking for tenure. You have to save that work to once you get tenure. Like, so how do you navigate this, right? I think on the other side is also remembering that we each bring expertise to the table. Is that remembering our own, we have expertise we are bringing from theory, from institutional capacity and resources, and our communities are bringing that community expertise and knowledge, and that we're both sitting at the same table together, and recognizing and acknowledging that the power spaces that we each sit within. And I know it can be difficult and challenging to navigate. The other piece of advice that I give is to, well, I say there's two more. Find partners in your community that you would like to work with. So like Nikita, she is my transfer of trust. She has trust in the community. We partner together, and then she introduces me to the community. So I am not just some strange white American girl coming into a Bahamian community saying, I want to work with you. The other thing is take the time to listen. That I think it takes probably a year's worth of listening before you can even start to talk to a community about what it is that you might be able to bring to the table to truly get to understand what it is that they need. And that's another thing that I think funders and institutions are not quite so fond of right now, of giving you the time to just sit and listen.
So I was remiss in not knowing where that stop time is, but I wanted to see if anybody else had anything they wanted to talk about first before I figured it out.
Yeah, this is a really interesting discussion. I'm sorry I came in late, but I don't live on my emails, which I only get when I tune in. So I found out about it at 12:30. So my apologies. But there's to my mind, a remarkable synchronicity here, because I just finished reading a draft grant proposal by a young family medicine doc at Concord last night with a Robert Wood Johnson grant, which is clearly intended for community organizations to be the applicant. And to develop further strength and recognizes some of the the difficulties community organizations have, for example, in handling physical issues in a responsible manner, just don't have the infrastructure. And the RWJ people who are clearly community health advocates writing it and inspiring this grant, we're doing it. And this has been a pattern in my career over and over again. The people who read grant proposals are people who will have various positions, and this young doc is obviously committed to the absolutely right things, but he's an employee of Atrium, right? And there's a mismatch. So one of the sort of interesting things about this discussion is we're all concerned about climate change and sea level rise and all the issues of the environment, but I think particularly in these plague-ridden months, we're focused on healthcare. So I wonder if there might be some transmission of what you've been talking about today, more focused on healthcare and how you start it, particularly when we have an example of I won't say communities or public science, but we have a political example of someone who pretends to know more than the science. So what we've almost set up is a dichotomy between following the science, which means folks in white coats who have all the degrees, versus the sort of ability to trump this and to claim that public health people and such, well, they tell us one thing one day and another thing the next day. So is there some kind of dilemma here? And I mean, this is a vague question. Is there a dilemma the way and a particularly rough spot we've got in trying to marry individual involvement in a creative and collaborative way with the people with the credentials? And then secondly, are we in a particular time where healthcare issues might be particularly open to the kind of important, innovative methods which you are using to try to focus on dealing with collective problems? And with those vague questions, I'll shut up.
Well, I think I'll answer the second one, I think, easier, in that there is some really great research being done in public health right now around community-driven public health, community-based public health. And there's Mark, oh my gosh, I can't remember his name, who's in our public health, School of Public Health here at UNC Charlotte. His name is completely gone out of my head, but he has been doing some work on maybe not quite as in depth as I have, because I go to the extreme of participatory research. That it is the community members that are truly driving the research, to the point where if communities say, I don't want to be involved in this project, this is not my idea, this is not what we are interested in, the project stops. And talk about that is hard for especially academics to be able to say, okay, my project's not going to go any further.
Yeah.
But if you've done the groundwork leading up to it, you never have that, you don't have that result, because it's not your project, it's the community's project if you've done the due diligence of participatory research. But coming in and being able to say, yeah, no, this isn't the right thing, or even if the community's like, this isn't turning out the way that I expected it to. So I think that in public health that there are some really good movements in this field, but I think there could be more. I really don't, because I'm not deeply engaged in the public health, and Lisa may have, you may be able to actually answer that if you've come across anything in your research around ethics and citizen science dealing with public health.
Just briefly, we actually got an NSF grant to study DIY medicine, DIY approaches to COVID with an international web platform that's facilitating basically biohackers trying to come up with better ventilators, better masks, maybe some tests, some treatments. So yeah, there's definitely, whether they call themselves citizen scientists or community scientists, those names are loaded in different groups.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. The community science, the terminology in this world is and it's actually getting really heated again now about what do we call this work. In my perspective, I call public science as the umbrella. Community science is community members driving the science, and citizen science is volunteer science that are not getting paid for doing the science, but are voluntarily participating. But there are some fuzzy differences that are not doing that quite in the same light. I tend to follow the community members. There's a long history of community science, especially in the environmental justice movement here in America, that much of the environmental justice work has been driven by community scientists in the communities that academics have overlooked for many years and not worked in the community. So they took it upon themselves to do research in their own communities. Nobody else is going to do it. Well, then they were going to do it themselves. And that's something that's been a little bit contentious with people co-opting this term community science, about who owns it, what does it mean, who defines it. And there's some things that have happened that recently with the term community science. I think it's going to take it even further away from the communities. We'll see how that happens. But you also asked about this, the current political climate and community collective action. I think if I'm kind of summing up the first part of your question, Bill.
Yeah, yes.
And I think that the pushback when, well, I think it's disciplinarily in our academic institutions. I'll take it from this perspective. I think it depends on the discipline as to how well it's accepted and how well it's pushed back. upon. In biology, it depends on who you ask. We're still debating the question of, is citizen science collected data or community member collected data valid? Can it be data that's good enough? And I think Lisa's also got a project they've been working on data, but is the data good enough when community members have collected it to use in science, in real science? And that has, there's much research that has dispelled that myth. But there's still the perceptions from scientists about what makes good data, and is this a good methodology for collecting data. But I think that when you talk about, there's some challenges to what I'll say, we have a lot of conversations in our work around colonialism and academics, and there's some challenges, I think, when we talk about community members being equals with us as academics with their community knowledge, and bringing equal spaces to what we bring from our theoretical spaces. And I think some people feel very challenged by that how could a community member possibly be on the same level of knowledge that we are when we've studied our field for numerous years and become experts in this space, and how could they possibly be on equal spaces as us? And I challenge that, because I'm like, because they've had this lived experience that you possibly can't have, and that to do true authentic research actually relies 100% on, if you're doing the research you claim to want to do with the communities. So, and I think that's a whole other conversation for a whole other day, but around the way that colonialism and science, and how we have set up this whole system to disadvantage communities that we work with based on this hierarchy of who does science.
And maybe perhaps a distinction needs to be made between the status of the people doing the work and science as a body of knowledge. And I think that what we're creating, you know, and some of it may be useful, but one of the things I think we've seen is that in the last year or so, 2 years, 4 years, is the legitimacy, basically the acceptance of relatively established scientific principles seems increasingly to be at least challengeable, without people losing their own, you know, commentators using their own credibility. I mean, we had it a week ago with Trump saying, well, science is changing, or, you know, when he was responding to the environmental secretary in California in that nicely videotaped 15 seconds interchange. So, you know, there may be a price. It's important not to have the public in the agora confuse citizen science the way you're describing it, in which there are protocols for collecting the data, which are undoubtedly formulated in a dialogue between trained professionals and the community, and just the realities of what it's like in the real world collecting data, as distinct from the legitimacy of a body of knowledge that's created from that, and our ability simply to say, whatever your opinion is equally valid. All opinions are equally valid. And the great thing about you know, scientific knowledge is presumably it's a collaborative effort. And what's being done with citizen science is we're expanding the collaboration to produce this body of knowledge in a very healthy and way which will actually improve the quality of the output. Does that distinction make any sense?
Yeah, I think really what it sounds like we're getting at is this distinction of who defines expertise, and what makes someone an expert at something. And so when I look at my work, is we bring expertise from the theoretical knowledge that we have gone we have studied this specific topic for X amount of years, And we bring that knowledge of expertise that can't be replaced just because someone goes, well, I think I'd like to challenge that.
Sure.
At the same time, communities bring expert knowledge of place. And we can't replace that just because I say, well, I studied it on a map, so all of a sudden I'm an expert of this place. And so this is where that community researcher piece really comes together. But it is, how do we define what an expert at something is? And it's much more than somebody from the public just going, well, I think such and such, when it's completely blunder.
Yeah. Thanks. That's, I think that I found this very useful discussion. Thank you for your presentation.
I mean, I love thinking through, like, and we have, Nikita and I've had, I can't count how many hours of discussions around a lot of these philosophical pieces around science and around, especially I'm really fascinated, like I said before, around the colonialism of science and how do we start to like break that down. And I know that those are much deeper conversations that aren't, those are years worth of discussions to take on. But, I think that how do we even call experts? It still goes back to that. Like, who's an expert? What defines that? What makes me an expert at something versus you an expert at something? I don't know. Is it because those 3 letters behind my name? Is that what my expertise is marked by?
Yeah, the credentialing question is a huge one, right? Because people from disadvantaged communities aren't going to have access to the credentials, no matter what their expertise is, right? There's a SAS component being able to get the credentials. So yeah, that's a huge issue, I think.
Yeah.
And Bill knows this better than me, but the roots of that go back in the early 1800s, right? With the way the university developed and really long-standing structures of knowledge and how we authenticate people. So these are really, I think, fundamental problems if I understand them at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, we've had 2 or 3 people say they have other talks they have to go to or other calls, which maybe that's the best way to keep time. Does anybody want to add anything else? All right, well, if not, you can join me in thanking Angel. This is great. And I look forward to seeing everyone next time.
Thank you for having me today. It was really nice to see some of you again from other times and to see some of you for the first time. Have a great rest of your week.
Great, you too. All right,
And if
thank
you ever
you.
want to talk about any of this stuff more, I am very passionate about these topics. And I would say I'm on campus, but I am available. I am in Charlotte and available by Zoom for further conversations.
Great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.